Is the PlayStation brand destroying its own reputation? I think we're all wondering at the moment how it's possible that one of the coolest brands ever conceived is now falling into such disrepute. Let's explore this and try and work out what went wrong and when and how it's gotten this far. Let's rewind back to the early 90s, which was an era in which the PlayStation had positioned itself as the top dog. But just before all of this, the top dog before that was obviously Nintendo. So it was a completely different time before PlayStation came around. We had the NES, the Super Nintendo and the Game Boy, which are all back-to-back best sellers. But despite all of their past successes, it got to a point where Nintendo ended up becoming victims of their own hubris. They had gotten to a point with their own success where they had become monopolistic, they'd become heavy-handed with censorship, they'd become openly predatory, extremely protectionist, like ridiculously protectionist. And most noteworthy of all, they had become anti-consumer. I feel like that's a really significant point to remember when it comes to the downfalls of really successful companies. But as horrible as Nintendo ended up being back in the 90s, we would end up being saved by the Sony PlayStation, a product that in itself would only come into existence due to Nintendo's overconfidence and hubris after their failed partnership over a CD add-on. First released in 1994, the Sony PlayStation was the console that gamers literally had dreamed of. Games are cheaper, publishers were treated with more respect. So an example of this would be Squaresoft. Their games, well, the Final Fantasy series, had traditionally always been on Nintendo hardware, and all of a sudden here they were with Final Fantasy VII being released on the Sony PlayStation. And that's simply because Sony as a company were giving a better deal to developers. So a result of this would be that there were many more third-party games available on Sony hardware. Obviously, more developers, more games, more reasons to buy a PlayStation. The censorship was really dialed back with the Sony PlayStation. So we was getting games that were scary and gory and basically just general horror themed games, etc., that were available on the Sony PlayStation that you would never ever had seen released on a Nintendo platform at that time. Nintendo was very squeaky clean, very family friendly, very much for the children. So the games were being released on CDs rather than geriatric cartridges. And the cartridges, you have to remember, those had an extremely limited amount of space on them. So one of the reasons why Squaresoft, I'm bringing them up again, hopped over to the PlayStation rather than remaining with Nintendo was because the N64 was going to be on cartridges yet again. And CDs just simply offered a huge amount more space than cartridges would. So for them, it was a very simple decision to hop from Nintendo hardware over to Sony PlayStation hardware instead. Because as you know, Final Fantasy VII was across 3 discs. And if it was on the N64, it would have been across something like 12 cartridges, which just wasn't going to be feasible. People genuinely respected the PlayStation brand for giving to us what Nintendo wouldn't, which was really significant at the time. You have to think of the time period. I mean, the 90s, it was all about like radical dudes and counterculture and being edgy, like the Attitude Era. That was like the essence of the 90s, you know, like Eminem and being rebellious. And that's what the PlayStation brand did. It offered the zeitgeist of the times, and that's what people wanted. And it wasn't just through things like slick marketing with the huge marketing budget that they would have had from their parent company, but it was also to do with like word of mouth and also doing cool things like, I don't know whether this happened in America, but it certainly did in England. You got PlayStations inside of nightclubs. You'd never have seen a Super Nintendo or an N64 set up inside of a nightclub. That would never have happened, but Sony was the cool and edgy brand, and they were moving away from being something that was targeted towards children. They were they were just targets. They were targeting children with certain games. They were targeting adults. It was a much more broadly appealing console than the Super Nintendo was and the Nintendo 64. So due to all of that good faith that had been generated by the success of the original PlayStation, that essentially meant that come the time of the PlayStation 2, that in itself ended up being the greatest selling console of all time. You have to think like how much hype that would have had, with everybody being absolutely crazy about the Sony PlayStation. Of course it's going to mean that their follow-up console was going to be crazily successful thereafter. So while the era of this Sony PlayStation 3 was a little bit more balanced, by the time we got the Sony PlayStation 4, the favour had swung right back in Sony's direction. But that wasn't necessarily to do with Sony having been absolutely brilliant and wonderful. At this point in time, what actually caused their success was everyone else's failings, really, if you look at it. I mean, like, for example, the Nintendo Wii U had ended up being an absolute disaster because people didn't realise that it was any different from the Wii. And then also, the Xbox One launch was utterly horrendous. Like, if you remember, Xbox told us, like as though we was going to accept this, that the moment you bought a game, it was then going to become locked to your system, therefore sharing games was not going to be a thing anymore. And then there was also going to be their strange data management policies. They wanted everyone to have their Kinect attached to the console at all times. Like, what was going to stop them from spying on anyone? And then further to that, you had to be basically logged in to the internet with your machine, like at certain intervals, otherwise your account was going to get locked. Like, as if anybody at the time was going to accept that and be okay with it. No, that was absolutely ludicrous. But it was mistakes like that which ended up making Sony's job of convincing the market to purchase their console instead significantly easier. So it's not that Sony had done something wonderful, it's that everyone else had been completely rubbish. So you'd think that Sony being like, yeah, we're not interested in any of that. Yeah, borrow your mate's game, that's fine. We don't need you to have a camera on all the time. That's not a problem. You'd think that that'd be like a really good win for consumers. And in the short term, yeah, it was. It was great. It was going to be at that point that Sony would start seeing themselves as like this indestructible thing that was never going to have any issues with their consumers. It's like they thought at that time that they could do no wrong and that their consumer base was going to be happy with literally anything that they did. Like, they were the absolute winners and that no one was ever going to question anything they did at that point onwards. So let's begin covering this downfall until we get to the point that we're at today. So it would be at this point that Microsoft would literally be crawling around picking up the pieces of their reputation and doing what they could to salvage any shred of good reputation that they might have had left. So they would be doing things like reversing all of the anti-consumer features that they had on the Xbox One. They would begin working with other brands to ensure that games could be played cross-platform. So if you own, say, a particular multiplayer game on the Switch, then you would be able to play that cross-platform with anyone on the Xbox or PC. That was ridiculously consumer friendly and it was unprecedented. So this is the sad part. So this cross-play feature was actually offered to PlayStation at the time and they turned it down. They literally turned it down, which is absolutely ridiculous. So rather than doing what was in the best interests of the consumers, instead they're like shoring up. They're like, no way, Jose, we'll have nothing to do with that. Like, this is one of the examples of things that Sony would start doing which would start raising eyebrows. I think it's significant to remember that Sony built their reputation about being very, very consumer friendly. You have to remember, back with the original PlayStation, they were offering to consumers what they couldn't get with Nintendo. And now that they're at the top of the pile, now that they're at the height of their success, they're now starting to be like, well, actually, they're starting essentially what's a bit of a 180 in the way that they treat their own consumer base. Something else to consider as well is that throughout its life cycle, Microsoft was constantly updating the Xbox One to make it backwards compatible with more and more of its old games. And I'm not just talking Xbox 360 games, but I'm also talking original Xbox games as well. The Sony PlayStation 4, on the other hand, was the first PlayStation console that was not backwards compatible with any of its older games. To make things worse, it would be at this point in time that Sony, instead of making games backwards compatible, they were remastering old games, like, here's the classic example, The Last of Us, and then making people go out and re-buy the same games again for more money to play on the newer hardware, even though they probably already owned the game on older hardware. It was just absolutely ludicrous. And again, it's another example of Sony being, well, quite frankly, anti-consumer. Further momentum would switch in the consumer friendliness department when in 2017, Game Pass was introduced by Microsoft, which was something that Sony wasn't offering at the time. I mean, they would eventually respond with the Sony PlayStation Plus network, but at the time, Game Pass, you had like a constantly rotating catalogue of games that you could play, and any brand new first party games were immediately available on Game Pass. That was like a huge incentive at the time for people to sign up to that service. Obviously, the PlayStation Plus service did end up being revamped by Sony, but that was only really in response to Game Pass, and not because they were being innovative and consumer friendly in their own right. And further to that, Sony was not offering brand new games on their live service like Game Pass was. So again, it's just more and more things that when you look at them, they're all little details, but it's just adding up to more and more reasons to look at Sony like sideways a bit. As you can see at this point, the PlayStation brand was overconfident and way too comfortable in their position, and therefore were making multiple significant poor choices which were not in consumers' interests. Xbox, on the other hand, was scrambling to make up for their huge past mistakes. So whereas the PlayStation brand wasn't quite yet considered villains, they were no longer the cool kids on the block doing all the right things. This brings us to the current generation, where the PlayStation brand is now thought of in a completely different way than they ever were before. We're no longer in an era where the PlayStation is the counterculture brand, trying to give it to the man and trying to topple the conservative Nintendo. In fact, Nintendo themselves now have changed dramatically from who they were back in the 90s, with some people even thinking of the Switch being the cool alternative to the PlayStation right now. So this is now so extreme that it's starting to look like the Switch may even overtake the PlayStation 2 sales-wise and become the best-selling console of all time. The PlayStation 5 has done all right, but it's not on the same trajectory that the PlayStation 4 was. So apart from the Switch being very popular, due to all of the console brands' anti-consumer practices, more and more gamers than ever before are now choosing to stick with Steam, as it's a platform that has consistently demonstrated that it will act in consumers' interests. Speaking of Steam, which is amazing, you can get so many bargains on digital purchases which you know are safer than on the PlayStation. However, I know where you can get digital games for Steam and the PlayStation for that matter as well as the PC and the Xbox and basically nearly all the other platforms for up to 90% cheaper than usual, and I'm not exaggerating. Today's sponsor, Instant Gaming, provides you with just that, so use my affiliate link now and grab a dozen bargains for pennies and get cheap games while supporting this channel simultaneously. Lady Decades does what Sony don't. The PlayStation brand in the last few months has been caught up in controversy after controversy after controversy. So just an example of this, we've had them being heavy-handed when it comes to censorship in the Stellar Blade game, very much like, if you think about it, how Nintendo was with Mortal Kombat back in the 90s. But an even bigger shitstorm has occurred around players being told that they need a PSN account to be able to play Helldivers 2, which, as we all know, has resulted in people in over 100 countries losing access to Helldivers 2 after they'd already bought it because you can't get a PSN account in over 100 countries. PlayStation has gone back on that, but they've gone and done it again with the new version of Ghost of Tsushima. Are they not learning from their mistakes? It's absolutely ludicrous that they're doing that. The long and short of it is that they either think that we are stupid or they are completely deluded. I mean, they're no longer the cool kids anymore, and they're not trying to be either. So remember when I said earlier that back in the 90s they were trying to be cool and edgy and were even putting PlayStations inside of nightclubs and marketing towards all sorts of people, not only children, they were marketing towards teenagers and adults as well. Well, now they seem to be doing the complete opposite. All of a sudden they're trying to display themselves as being virtuous and taking the moral high ground, and often making themselves look completely hypocritical in the process. Worse than that, they're coming across as very predatory. So many noted that there was rainbow flags present in Spider-Man 2 to express that the company really cares about diversity and inclusion. But apparently that's only when it suits them, because everyone also noticed that in the Saudi Arabian version of the game, all of the rainbow flags have been removed, as well as any LGBT storylines that were now completely missing from the game. So it just goes to show that they don't actually care about these things. They only care about these things when they think it's going to make them some money. It's all just coming across as very spineless and very money grabbing. Like, I'm very much of the mindset that either include these morals and diversity and inclusion and everything consistently everywhere, or don't include it at all. Like, don't just cherry pick it to go here or there and, oh, well, we won't make money if we include it over there, but we will make money if we include it over here. Like, just be consistent and have one message, because at the moment they're coming across as incredibly insincere. They're no longer part of the zeitgeist of modern living. In fact, I feel like they've become more like the Nintendo of the 90s. You know, the company that ended up losing it all due to their own self-importance and disrespect of consumers, assuming that literally anyone would buy anything that they sold, no matter what. And that's how PlayStation feels to me right now. Except that's not the case. Otherwise, they wouldn't be getting such a bad rap at the moment. So with many people speculating that there may very well be a video game crash on the horizon, it seems that all of these current consoles are essentially going to end up burning on a bonfire of their own hubris, rather than survive the coming storm. And ironically, it actually looks like it might be Nintendo coming in yet again 40 years again after the first video game crash to swoop in and save us from said video game crash. So if you want to mug off Sony by buying some of their own games but on the cheap with huge discounts, then feel free to use my Instant Gaming affiliate link down below in the description and in the pinned comment. Happy shopping and see you next time.